Morning and welcome to the 26th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have received apologies from Michael Mara. Before we start, I want to put on record our thanks to the Lithuanian MPs and the organisations and officials who met us during our short fact-finding visit to the beautiful and extremely clean city of Vilnius last week. Never been anywhere so immaculate, I have to say. Lithuania shares similar challenges to Scotland on demographics and public service reform, and we had fruitful discussions with our counterparts on long-term strategic thinking and growing the economy. We will draw on these discussions as we continue our pre-budget scrutiny and also publish a summary note of the visit very soon. On today's agenda, we have one item, which is to take evidence from the Scottish Government on responding to long-term fiscal pressures. I welcome to the meeting the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, Shona Robeson MSP. The Cabinet Secretary is accompanied by Scottish Government officials, Richard McCallum, Director of Public Spending, Lucy O'Carroll, Director of Tax, and Ailsa Black, Deputy Director of Budget and Fiscal Coordination. And I'd like to wish the Cabinet Secretary good morning and invite her to make a short opening statement.
Well, good morning, Convener and members of the committee. And your visit to Lithuania sounds very interesting. Be happy to follow up on some of the issues that arose there, perhaps at a later session. But I very much welcome today's discussions as part of the committee's pre-budget scrutiny. As a government, we are committed to increasing the transparency in our budget setting process and ensuring that value for money and fiscal sustainability is achieved in the decisions that we reach. As discussed in detail at our last session, the medium-term financial strategy and its accompanying delivery plan reinforce the government's commitment to managing the public finances responsibly, delivering a balanced budget each year alongside strengthening the fiscal position over the medium term. Key to our approach will be redirecting resources to the most impactful interventions that support our strategic priorities, and our public service reform strategy will tackle systemic barriers to reforming public services over the longer term. I've looked across everything we do and will make the changes required to protect services, driving efficiency in all areas of service delivery, including significant efficiency and reform savings across the public sector and reducing the size of the public sector workforce. This sets the landscape for our work on developing the 26-27 Scottish Budget. I look ahead to the new budget. I've followed with interest the committee's pre-budget scrutiny sessions with stakeholders, and I look forward to exploring the topics and issues raised with members. The committee is aware that since we last met, the UK Government announced its intention to deliver its autumn statement on the 26th of November. It was disappointing that there was no advance discussion with the Scottish Government on this, given the potential impact it creates for the Scottish budget. And with a delay to the Scottish Budget and the accompanying fiscal publications now unavoidable, members will be aware of my letter of the 19th of September and my inclination to propose Thursday the 15th of January 2026 as the potential publication date for the 2026-27 Scottish Budget. And I'm very keen to discuss this further with the committee and to seek your views on potential plans for the budget. I appreciate it's difficult for us all, and I very carefully considered the need to allow sufficient time for SFC forecasting, parliamentary scrutiny as well as Scottish Government considerations. The integrated nature of the Scottish Budget means that it is important to keep the four fiscal publications aligned together, and I'm therefore keen that the Scottish Budget, the Spending Review, the Infrastructure Investment Plan and the Infrastructure Delivery Pipeline continue to proceed as a package and are published at the same time. But I appreciate there may be differing views, and I'm happy to discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That was greatly appreciated. You know, some of the more starry-eyed and excitable members of the Labour Party told us last year that after a UK general election, Scotland would be at the heart of the UK government. I think the fact that the Scottish Government wasn't even consulted on the date of the autumn statement gives a lie to that, as does many other developments over the last 14 or 15 months. I think it's really disappointing that the autumn statement is going to be on the 26th November, 4 weeks after last year, and that, I can understand the difficulties that has for the Scottish Government. It also presents difficulties for the committee in terms of scrutiny, as you can imagine. The idea of having the budget on the 15th of January means it will be 50 days after the autumn statement. And I think we're all aware that includes a fortnight over Christmas. So if we exclude that, it's the same length of time as last year. But even so, 15th is very late. It's a Thursday. It would only give the committee the following Tuesday to cobble together some kind of scrutiny. And so I realise it will be difficult for officials and the Scottish Fiscal Commission and others, but but I think that if we were to have the draft budget on the 7th, Wednesday the 7th of January, which would be a week and a day earlier than is being suggested, it would allow for at least more effective scrutiny and have some breathing space post draft budget for deliberate consideration with regard to that. So I'm hoping, I'm not asking you to give us a definite answer today on that. It would be great if you could, but I hope that this is something that you go back and consider, because I do think that the truncating of scrutiny, I think, would be very disappointing for the committee and indeed the whole management of the draft budget as we go forward. So I don't know if you want to comment on any of those points before
I mean, look, I do very
questions.
much appreciate the points that you're making, and of course I'll reflect on everything that's said today around the timing on the budget and of course other matters. But I guess just going back to the timing of the budget being intrinsically linked to the SFC's final deadline for receiving detailed information on borrowing, funding, expenditure and public sector pay proposals. So the protocol with the SFC requires that we can reconfirm this information 4 working days before budget. So taking the 15th of January date, that would be the 9th of January. However, for a 7th of January budget, as you're suggesting, that would be, I think, the 29th of December.
Yeah, slightly earlier.
Now, the issue there would be that, all the public holidays during that period and the requirement for us to get all of that information, and having that kind of first working week in January to work with SFC to finalise this information. There's also the unknowns at the moment, so we don't know, for example, what might emerge on the 26th of November in terms of any new tax propositions, and we don't know if they're in a space that impact on the Scottish budget and devolved taxes. That is going to be a complicating factor that the SFC are going to have time to work through. So, I am very willing, convener, to reflect on all the committee members' views today of the date, but I am just trying to set out some of the challenges that would come with that. Alistair, I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, I suppose just to add slightly to those comments, Cabinet Secretary. So one of the key considerations for us, as we've looked at the difference between a 15th of January publication date and a week earlier.
Better. I mean, a Thursday's a terrible day, I think.
So look, I am up for thinking about whether earlier that week, for example, could be a compromise, just would give us that first few days back just to finalise things. But I am not wedded to it being a Thursday for sure. But I guess it's just trying to find a meeting in the middle where we give that we can reach.
I just assumed we were all going to have to work to a large extent over the festive period.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Sadly,
it's one of my busiest
anyway.
times.
Sorry.
So just highlight that the difference of a week amounts to 10 days in being able to finalise the final funding, spending, borrowing, pay and workforce policy position, which we need to communicate to the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So if it was the 15th of January, then we would be able to work to a period that would be 10 days later than going with a week before. So if we went with a week before, just given where the public holidays fall over New Year, we would need to be confirming all of those details during the Christmas recess period, which would be challenging. It's possible, but it's important for members to be aware of that.
Well, my lifetime we've had inventions like, the internet, email, telephones. Well, that was actually before my time. That was in Liz's, actually. But so I don't think it's impossible. Certainly, any step forward progress can make on that would be helpful. Certainly for our scrutiny. One thing I would say, I want to commend the government, though, the fact that all the 4 plans are going to be together. I think that's really important. I was going to ask you specifically about that, and you've answered that already. So I think that's going to be very helpful, having all these documents together. And I do realise that's also a lot of work for the government, but it's certainly what we've been looking for. Now, in terms of getting into some of the meat of some of the other things we want to discuss today, I mean, we've obviously taken evidence on pre-budget scrutiny for a number of weeks, and one of the issues is about prioritisation. So the government has talked about prioritisation, and you talked today about areas of need. But again, one of the things that we've found is that it's always easy to talk about what's being prioritised. But of course, a quid pro on that is if you're prioritising one thing, then you must be deprioritising something else. So what is going to be deprioritised as we go forward?
So I've been given, this came up in the last session, and I think a further example of that is where within portfolios prioritisation is given. So if you take the health portfolio, for example, clear priority has been given to those patient-facing frontline health boards that have had a real terms uplift and will continue to get a real terms uplift compared to the non-patient facing health boards where they have essentially flat cash and a higher level of efficiency savings. So that's us saying, right, folks, the priority needs to be those patient delivering frontline boards, and those other areas of the NHS are going to have to do things differently and reduce or drive efficiency savings and look at shared services and so on and so forth. So even within portfolios, we're trying to ensure that the priority is given to those frontline services. Again, when you look at the target for corporate reduction in staff around, I think it's 20% target, that is really sending out a clear message that the corporate functions of our public sector as a whole need to be done differently. They need to reduce, they need to use digital innovations and automation in order to release savings for frontline services. So that needs to permeate through every part of the public sector, through every portfolio's interests, but that is, I guess, the principle of what we're working towards.
I understand exactly what you're saying, and I certainly wouldn't be arguing against that, but you're talking about within portfolios, but there's issues across portfolios. So, for example, you'll be well aware of the concern that's come out, and it's been pointed out to us very directly, the issue facing the college sector now. We know there's a chronic shortage of skills, etc. in Scotland. Colleges are intrinsic to ensuring that we have the skills that we require. They've suffered a 17% reduction in real terms over the last 5 years. They've cut their staff by 8.7%. They've already cut student numbers by 12%. And so, are they not considered a priority, for example, for trying to reverse some of that? If we are genuinely trying to get people out of poverty, we're not going to be able to do that just by increasing their benefits. We have to actually give them the skills they need so that they can go out and earn for themselves and their families, surely, and colleges are a part of that. So, taking on board all you've said about efficiencies within portfolios, for those who've already been effectively squeezed over the last few years, is there going to be any light at the tunnel so that they will get at least inflation, if not a slight, and frankly that's one sector that I would hope would get an above inflation increase to try and deliver what the Scottish Government's trying to do in terms of its poverty and skills agendas? So,
look, I recognise the importance of our FE and HE sectors. I mean, the college sector did receive an increase in teaching funding in the 25-26 budget. But I take your point. It was below inflation, though. Well, I take your point, and I think there is something about the transformation of the college estate going forward. So if you look at if you don't mind me reaching into my own patch, but you know, the plans that Dundee and Angus College have, they have been, I think, quite forward in their thinking. So they've taken some of the hard decisions about some of the courses provided, trying to align what they provide more with the needs of the workforce, the local employers, and the skills required. And they have ambitious plans for their estate as well. And I think there is something in the transformation space around, well, what does our college estate look like in the future? What does it provide? And I think there is a wider question for the whole skills sector. And of course, we've had, some, big reviews of that in the not too distant past that have indicated that, we do need to make sure that our skills landscape is delivering what young people and not so young people require for the workplace. And colleges provide a key part of that. I am not unsympathetic to the point you're making, Convener.
The Scottish Government inherited a total mess in colleges. I mean, in my own area, Kilwinning, which is in Cunningham South, actually was linked in with Invert, was the same college as Greenock. I mean, the James Watt College is absolute nonsense. And the reorganisation, I think, has been really effective. I think it's made things much more focused. There's fewer. All the daft 5-hour courses, not 5 hours a week, 5 hours in total, have all been bumped, and there's a much more focus on business and connection with business. But we've now got the stage where a lot of that work's been done, and yet they're still being expected to squeeze. And, although in your area there's no doubt innovations there are, as in my area as well, but you can't continue to innovate while core budgets are being reduced or not allowed to grow. I mean, I think that's just frankly being unrealistic. So I do hope that there'll be greater consideration given in terms of that sector. Now, in terms of local government, one of the things that you indicated when we met 4 weeks ago was that you said there's agreement on 95% of arrangements being discussed for a new fiscal framework with local government. Although views differ regarding rules-based budget. And so I'm just wondering if there's been any progress over the last month and where we'll be, hopefully, by budget time, or indeed, if not, by the end of March.
Well, yeah, so work continues, Convener, and I guess there is a slight frustration in that, we are in agreement with, I think what I said, 95% of it, and a lot of it has already been applied in practice. I think I referred previous session to that early engagement, open book, all of that. These are all principles of the framework, and most recently, actually, in regards to local government pay, again, very much in line with the framework. So I guess there is a little bit of frustration about not securing agreement to publish, although those discussions are ongoing because of, I think I mentioned previously that the issue of, rules-based funding. And I have been in discussions with COSLA about the limitations and difficulties with rules-based funding. And if you take the employer's national insurance contribution issue, that is a very good example of why, if you stick to a rules-based funding, it can be to your disadvantage when you have something like ENIX arising unexpectedly. So I would hope we could reach a position where we agree on 95% of it. Let's just secure that and have that as the framework for the way we do business, and we can continue to discuss future funding formulas over here, but it shouldn't stop us kind of grasping and securing the progress that's been made, not least around the process around budget, which I think local government themselves has said has been the best for many years. So we're in this process bit, and I'm hoping that we can get through it.
Well, you can be knocked off field by things like the employer's national insurance contribution increase. I mean, 54% of the council tax increase in North Ayrshire that I represent is going just into paying ENIX, frankly, and that's just the direct cost, some £6.8 million a year. But I do think that, given the fact that we were told that the deal was likely to be in February of this year, in January we were told that, it just seemed disappointing that we can't quite get this concluded, and I'm sure myself and others would like to see that concluded quickly. Now, one of the things that witnesses talked about when they talked about capital, and we've talked about capital over the years, and there's been great frustration in the committee that the investment pipeline always seems to be just beyond us. You know, it's like a donkey with a carrot on the end of a stick. We keep pursuing it, but we never quite get to actually seeing what that infrastructure pipeline is. When it is produced, will it contain, as some of the witnesses have asked, shovel-ready projects? Because obviously capital can fluctuate, and one of the concerns is that sometimes at the end of the financial year, capital is being rolled over when, if there were shovel-ready projects, there'd be much more, there'd be a bit more flexibility in terms of being able to deliver on some of those projects short term.
Yeah, so it will cover infrastructure projects over 5 million and programmes over 20 million. So there's a lot below that are small projects. So this will be for, it'll set out, these are the projects that have had their, either got their business case or have got their business case in process, and then there'll be those that are the next phase beyond that. And of course, there will be big differences in terms of some of those national infrastructure projects that will be the big projects and some of the more local infrastructure projects. So, we are constrained by the capital outlook, as you are aware. Convener, we have got a very disappointing capital outlook from the spending review. So we are very exercised at the moment about how we can expand that capital envelope through other means. Because you'll appreciate that we've got a lot of ambition in the capital space, and we don't want to be constrained in that ambition. So we are giving a lot of thought to that. And we will set all of that out when we come to it in January.
Thank you. Now, you touched earlier on about improving efficiency within portfolios, for example, and you previously said that you're looking to reduce administration costs by some 20% across the public sector in a managed way. So over what time period is this going to be delivered, and how is it going to be delivered specifically? So
it's over a 5-year period. And it is being delivered through a number of mechanisms that Ivan McKee has set out in terms of the framework. So we would expect every part of the public sector to produce plans as to how they are going to reduce their corporate costs. Some of that will be in the shared services space, so sharing some of those corporate functions, whether it's HR, whether it's payroll, and of course we've got our own Oracle system that is there as an offer to public sector. There's a number of public sector organisations that have approached Scottish Government about coming onto the Oracle system, and it will mean that they'll have to look at how those functions are shared, rather than every single health board having all of those functions, every part of the public sector, even some of our small public bodies having all of those separate functions. We just, that cannot be the way forward. So each area, each public body, each part of the public sector is expected to set out the detailed plans of how they're going to get there and make those efficiencies. And Ivan McKee is regularly monitoring that as it comes in. The Invest to Save funding and investment was also important to oil the wheels of some of that. So some of that might be in the voluntary redundancy space, but others will be about automation, being able to do things differently. And there's been a lot of very interesting bids for that money that have been agreed. Richard, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about.
Yeah. It's over the five-year period, as the Cabinet Secretary says, through to 29-30. We've had the Invest to Save plan in place already, we've seen some benefits in terms of having that in place in the current financial year, and that's obviously going to be a big part of considerations for the spending review and how that might be implemented and used moving forward. Essentially what we're really expecting or requiring of portfolios is, as the Cabinet Secretary said, delivery plans at portfolio level, and that should include how individual public sector bodies will look at the administration target. There is around 20%. I think what we're really hoping though and expecting is that it actually stimulates some different ways of thinking, and people don't just come with the approach of saying, right, we're going to take 20% off by just cutting here and here. This is actually to provoke and stimulate different ways of working, different ways of reform, looking at how different bodies can share services in different ways, and that's what we're currently focused on and working with the Minister for Public Finance on. Thanks.
Touched on spend to save, which we're going to ask you about anyway, because I mean witnesses were quite supportive of that, very supportive. But they just said 30 million is not enough to really do more than scratch the surface. You know, I mean you really need a bigger fund if you're going to make fundamental change. So the more you invest to save, the more radical the change is likely to be, and the swifter. Is that a fair comment?
We needed,
do you think?
we needed to start somewhere, and we wanted to see what the interest and level of ambition and ideas would be for an invest to save fund of that magnitude. But we are very thoughtful about, well, firstly, the need to keep that fund going beyond 1 year. And secondly, what's the level of that fund? What are the things, what are the ideas that maybe came in that weren't able to be funded through that pot, for example? Can we just really crank up some of that momentum? So we are going to be giving that some thought. I'm personally very keen to keep that going.
Okay, just a couple more points from me, because colleagues are obviously keen to come in, as they always are. Not quite champing at the bit, I have to say, but they're keen to come in. You know, they're all kind of very relaxed this morning, I feel. Okay, so civil service numbers. Understand the government's quite ambitious in terms of reducing the number of civil servants. What's going to be the annual target over the next 5 years in terms of reduction?
Have you got the numbers, Richard?
I don't have the numbers in front, but I think the Minister for Public Finance, and I think even when you took evidence from the Permanent Secretary, the expectation that the same approach that's applied to the wider public sector will be applied to the civil service, the core Scottish Government. So that expectation around the 20% reduction in admin costs over that 5-year period is something that certainly the Perm Sec is very much focused on, and that clear challenge has been given. So that's the expectation. The expectation is the Scottish Government needs to lead this through, lead from the front in terms of delivering that.
So I think it was about 0.4% reduction in workforce annualised. I can give you, we did have the numbers, I just can't quite get them to hand, but I can write with those numbers. But essentially, convener, it is a downward trajectory.
8% reduction in over 5 years, in terms of the 20% improvement in efficiency might reduce the workforce by 20% over 5 years, which would be 4% a year.
Yeah.
Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But in terms of what that leaves us, in terms of the actual numbers, I will come back to you with that. But yeah, I mean, it is significant, but in the bigger scale, as you've just said, it is more than achievable. But it has to be done in the right way. So it isn't about just randomly taking an axe to services. It's about doing it in a way that is in the main through natural attrition, voluntary severance, and we've talked before about being clear about the no compulsory redundancy policy, that in extremis, if all other routes have been explored, then that remains a possibility.
Griffin, he told us that in a response to a question from Michelle, it were 4,000 managers out of a workforce of 7,000, so it looks like it's all chiefs and nae braves, if you know what I mean. And, so one would have thought that if you were looking to reduce and improve efficiency, the civil service does seem relatively top-heavy compared to other organisations.
Well, it has to be across the board, and it has to be, so for example, we need to lead by example, and there have been changes made in Director DG territory to make sure that we can't ask others to do things that the top level of civil service is not prepared to do itself. So there's been a reduction in the number there in order to lead by example. My own portfolio needs to very much lead by example. We need to, though, make sure in doing all of that we're not losing the investment in, say, digital and automation that needs to be
experience. I mean, I appreciate that. I remember in a Glasgow City Council 30 years ago suggesting to reduce the number of directors from 21 to 12, and the administration scoffed and says we can't run a city with only 12 directors, and a year later they reduced them to 7. So it depends what they actually do. Just a couple of wee things to touch on then. One is just I noticed the proceeds of crime. There seems to still be an issue between the Scottish and UK governments over the impact of proceeds of crime, and the block grant's been held back by 4.3 million over this. I'm just wondering if this is something that is going to be resolved soon, or is just going to keep dragging on, because obviously 4.3 million lost to our budget.
I will check with Justice colleagues exactly where that's got to, Convener, and I'll come back to you. But, yeah.
Okay. And lastly, for me, Lithuania 2050, that's a kind of vision that we talked about when we met Lithuanian colleagues, parliamentarian and indeed officials, how they're looking to produce. They've got a committee for the future, and one of the things they're looking to do is to say, where do we want our country to be in 2050, and how do we ensure that vision is accepted across the board? To a large extent it has been, and how we deliver towards that vision. So it's just wondering whether the Scottish Government, Finland incidentally has got a committee of the future as well. It's a leading country in Europe in terms of long-term strategic planning and thinking, and I know that the Scottish Government, partly because of the way the UK budget works, etc., tends to kind of have to find its way year on year. But is that something the Scottish Government would look to do? Have a long-term strategic vision of the future? Because I think it's certainly important, and it means that the way they try and structure it in Lithuania as a civic society, as well as government, etc., not everyone else, is all pulling towards that same long-term kind of goal and vision for the country.
I'm certainly happy to have a look at what others have done, whether it's Lithuania or Finland. I think there is something about, if you've got all of the levers, it's a bit easier to do that when you've got the whole picture. But that's not to say there's not something that we could do, and I'm very happy to have a look at that. I was keen to see ideas from elsewhere, and there may be some merit, particularly if, and I know this is maybe quite difficult in the current political climate, but if we were able to establish enough of a consensus about what that vision looks like, it may help to have a bit of a kind of landing space. We might disagree with these things over here, but this is where we agree things have to move towards. That might bring its benefits.
If you think about that in Ireland in '86, when the country was effectively a basket case, they all sat down and they decided, look, this is what we need to do, focus on infrastructure education. Look where Ireland's gone in the last 30, 40 years as a result. Phenomenal growth and success relative to where they were. Okay, I'm going to open up the session. Liz, to fall by Ross.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, can I just explore some of the responses that you gave to Mr Gibson in the first instance when you were talking about some of the commitments that we need in terms of prioritisation? When you came to committee on the 2nd of September, you said that the Scottish Government is prioritising those most in need, as well as programmes which are proven to work. So can I just break that down into its two component parts, namely, firstly, those most in need. Now, the convener put it to you that colleges was a group that perhaps could be defined as most in need. Can I ask what criteria is the Scottish Government using when it comes to a budget that's obviously going to be presented under very tight fiscal arrangements? What criteria are ministers using to try to examine those most in need in terms of pursuing economic growth and better outcomes?
So I guess from at a very high level, it goes back to the key priorities and the overarching key priority of eradicating child poverty. So do the programmes that we have help to achieve that aim? So there are various lenses that we would put existing spend, existing priorities through to try to ensure that there is some consistency. And we also have a requirement by law to produce another, the third child poverty delivery plan that is going to have a good chance of hitting the child poverty targets by 2030. So that is one example of the lens, I guess, of
colleges be included in these lanes when it comes to improving the skills agenda, ensuring that people are able to go back to work, and therefore that helps tackle child poverty, helps economic growth. Are colleges in that sort of space? So
I guess the overall answer is yes. Every part of the public sector would be looked at in terms of whether, what contribution can it bring. And there is a question, without giving any kind of trade secrets away, we have been having a debate about whether or not the bulk of the spend through, whether it's through colleges, through childcare, through health, does that overall spend do enough to eradicate child poverty? Because we do have a tendency sometimes that it's still the new bits of funding that we focus on. There is a question about the rest of the tens of billions that are being funded through our various structures. I'm quite thoughtful of that. And so whether it's colleges, whether it's a health service, we do need to interrogate whether what they are doing, whether it's our childcare programmes, whether what they're doing is actually going as far as they could to lift families out of poverty.
What's happening in terms of drilling down on some of the detail? You mentioned the health service, so let's take that, whereby there are some health boards that are more effective than others in terms of aspiring to the aims and ambitions of the Scottish Government. And you and I have sat through discussions in NHT side, for example, whereby there is a determination to try to learn from other health boards where there is good practice. So is the government going into that detail in terms of how effective the spend can be within different portfolios?
Yeah. So we have a subcommittee of the Cabinet that is specifically on tackling child poverty, eradicating child poverty. And at the last meeting of that, again, without giving any trade secrets away, we did get into that space. So, for example, we were talking about the mental health offering through the health service. Is it reaching those children and families who need it most? The same for the childcare offer that we have at the moment. Is it actually flexible enough to meet the needs of those families who are either not in work or are in low-paid work, part-time work, and actually, with more flexible childcare, it could assist them out of poverty. Employability, again. So just to assure you, we are looking at whether it's colleges, whether it's childcare, whether it's health, what more can we do with the tens of billions that we spend in our public services to point them more in the direction of getting people out of, lifting families out of poverty.
So just in terms of the second part of the statement that you gave on the 2nd of September and what you've said this morning about identifying programmes which are proven to work, and you've given some examples where the government's got some focus. I think the convener was suggesting there's a corollary to this, that if there are programmes that are clearly not working and haven't been working through previous budgets, I know you're not going to reveal any details about the budget just now, but has the government got a view as to what action it will take with those areas where the spending has not provided the outcomes that the government would like? I mean, or is the Scottish Government in a position whereby these are the programmes that are working well, and here's the evidence that supports the fact that they're working well, but actually here's quite a lot of evidence that's suggesting other programmes are not working well, and where money could therefore be saved or in some cases be transferred. Is the government at that stage?
Yeah, we are looking at, as you would expect, all of our programmes to challenge and to really bring that degree of examination. Or changing the direction of the spend. So if you take employability, for example, and we've talked about employability quite often. Here, there is a question about whether, it does, there are some good programmes within employability, but it's maybe, is it as focused as it could be? Is it reaching and supporting those families that we need it to? Is, for example, a lot of the third sector spend that has quite a lot of success in being able to reach families and support families, is that being sustained, or are we seeing funding not being sustained in areas where there's evidence that is working? So both are true. We need to interrogate spend to make sure it's delivering, but also where spend is delivering, we need to make sure that it's going to continue and that there's not a disconnect of something that's working well ending up not receiving third sector funding, for example.
Do you feel that there's sufficient transparency over these very difficult decisions? I think it is an extremely difficult task for the government in tight fiscal circumstances to make the right decisions about what is working well and what's not working well. Do you think there is sufficient transparency over the evidence about which policies are most effective in delivering for the government and those policies that are not effective and therefore potentially should be scrapped?
So we do rely on, I guess, the data that are provided that we can then interrogate. So whether it's what's been delivered through third sector grant funding, for example, what are the outcomes? What are the outcomes from the employability funding, some of which also goes to the third sector? What are the outcomes for from the Scottish Child Payment? I think where there's maybe less clear data might be, for example, does the huge investment in childcare, do we have the data to show which families are benefiting most from that and which families are not benefiting because it's not flexible enough? And I think those are the areas we really need to get into. On mental health, for example, are the mental health services that we're providing reaching folk that they need to reach to get people back into work, but also, importantly, avoid people falling out of work? And I'm not sure we have quite the data set that we would want.
There are issues about data set. We were told that at the start of this parliamentary term, whereby there are certain aspects of data, particularly in the labour market, that doesn't actually exist. And that obviously makes life difficult for the government. Just one final question. Again, on the 2nd of September, you intimated that when it came to something like free school meals, you weren't going to be able to roll out policies on the universal basis that you might like to have done, and that was because of fiscal constraints. Are there other areas whereby you are going to hold off rolling out policies, or in some cases rolling them back, because you don't have the money to finance them?
So there is always a balance to be struck around what is universal provision and what is more targeted. I feel that so in terms of when finance is constrained, how do you make sure that the resources that are available are eradicating or pointing in the direction to eradicate child poverty? And that is what lay behind the free school meal decision. So there may well be other areas that we're looking through that lens, and it may be about the approach to something, the approach to rolling out. So my feeling is, going back to childcare, that we need to look at is that policy, which incidentally has been in many ways a big success of that early years offer, and it's been a very important support to families. But I think it's a good point in time to ask ourselves, is it reaching and supporting families who need it most? And if not, what is it about the childcare system that is not able to do that? So is it too rigid? Is it not flexible enough? It was set up in a certain way, understandably, because it was an agreement with the local government, and that is what has been provided. Now, some of these things are not going to happen overnight, and we're not going to say, oh, well, as of a week on Tuesday, it's going to be provided in a different way. well, some of these things take time to change. My very strong view is, though, that we need to have those discussions about all areas of policy. So childcare, given it's such an important tool in eradicating child poverty, we know, for example, that that some families struggle to have childcare that is consistent throughout the day. And if you're a mum who is either not in work, or you're in low-paid work or part-time work, what works for her and her family, I think, is a good starting point. And if what we've got isn't quite working, then I think we need to look at how do we shift resources into being more effective in that space.
Thank you. Thank you, Camilla.
Tempted to say something, but I'm not going to. Right, Ross, to follow by John.
Thanks. I will say something. That's okay. Before I get on to my line of question, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It is quite hard to take the government's claim seriously that it's trying to get best value for money at a spend when reviews are quite rightly, independent reviews of existing government policies are commissioned, but then when the conclusions are politically inconvenient, they're discarded. We've discussed the small business bonus scheme before. There are clearly better ways to spend £250 million supporting small businesses. The government commissioned a review. The review said that no action has been taken in response. How would you expect us to take the government's claim seriously that it is trying to get best value for money when one of the most notable examples of a policy review, and it was great that the government was willing to commission that independent review, was simply discarded because it was clearly politically inconvenient?
Well, we've discussed the small business bonus scheme before, and I hope I haven't given you an impression that I don't think that it should stay as it is forever and a day. I think every area of policy should constantly be looked at in terms of whether it's meeting the objectives that it was set out to do. I guess I think I said this the last time. I'm just mindful of the current climate environment for small businesses. It's very difficult, and certainty is important of them knowing kind of what the landscape and support looks like. But we are open to looking at whether or not the businesses supported going forward are actually helping, for example, to meet the ambition of economic growth. Are the businesses supported? Is it helping to sustain town centres? In some of those cases it will, because some of those very small businesses tend to be also businesses that are located in some of our high streets, which we want to maintain and enhance, and given some of the other difficulties that businesses are facing, I'm just mindful that providing uncertainty about something that they rely on is maybe not the best time for it. But if you're asking me, does it stay the same forever and a day? No, it clearly shouldn't and won't.
So I totally accept the point around certainty, but that review was is now 3 years old, I believe. So if the primary concern here is that businesses require certainty, and we all agree on the importance of supporting small businesses in Scotland, you know, the overwhelming majority of businesses in Scotland are small, surely the government had the opportunity over the last couple of years to enter into a discussion with the small business community around how they best think £250 million can be spent supporting them, to ensure that any change is brought in over a longer period of time and there is certainty and they can plan around it. I find it just such a striking juxtaposition between what the remarks that you've made around getting best value for money, what's in the medium-term financial strategy, and then when reviews are actually commissioned and come back with what I think was useful but challenging conclusions, they're just discarded. It would be one thing for the government to say, OK, we will deal with this over a longer period of time because any snap changes in tax regimes can cause disruption. But that's not what happened, was it? It was just discarded because politically it was
discarded is a strong word. I'm not sure it was discarded.
What action was taken in response to it?
You know, we will continue to discuss with business the best way to shape the funding available to get to have the outcomes that we want. So, for example, we're talking to the hospitality sector at the moment about whether the current regime that is focused on turnover, for example, is fair to hospitality sector compared to retail, for example. So it's not that we're absolutely wedded to doing things the way they've always been done. I think maybe we're all just very cognizant of the current climate in terms of business trying to recover from COVID, the headwinds that are impacting on small businesses in particular. But it's not a bad challenge to say if the small business sector may well have ideas, and we're talking to them at the moment. I'm engaging with business about what next, what does the future look like. So it is a good time to have those discussions. And I think if it's framed, it's not about taking away. It's about what are the investments that could work better. And I think if it's framed in that way. So I'll continue to have those discussions. We'll have them through the budget process and then obviously into manifesto territory as well, I would think.
Thank you. So that wasn't what I was planning to ask about. I was just following up previous comment, but I'll condense this a bit. In terms of long-term financial planning, Fiscal Commission did an excellent piece of work around the cost of climate mitigation and adaptation. I was thinking recently of the Climate Ready Clyde Group, which is all the Greater Glasgow local authorities, SPT, SEPA and the University of Glasgow. Did an excellent report a couple of years ago projecting that the cost of climate breakdown, so not the efforts that we're taking to reduce emissions, but the cost of the impacts already locked in, will be something in the region of £400 million a year in the Greater Glasgow area by 2040. Does the government have any figures? Have you come to any conclusion around what the cost of adaptation is going to be, separate entirely from the record amount of money that is going into mitigation, and I think £4.9 billion of climate positive spending, which is excellent. But does the government have a ballpark figure that it's planning around in terms of the locked-in damage that's already going to be done?
So I will come back to you on that because so we're at the moment in the midst of working through obviously the carbon budgets, then the climate plan, and trying to align all of that against a very difficult fiscal backdrop. But I think you are right to challenge around the elements that are related to adaptation and the elements that are aligned to mitigation. I think the question is, how do we pay for it? And it cannot all come from the public purse because there's just not enough funding. So we have to look at how do we lever in private sector investment and incentivise that. Now, part of that will be about, so if you take, for example, district heating systems. There is clearly a financial model there that can work. Just need to push forward with it, and it can be frustratingly slow, but there is a financial model there that can work, that uses the public sector to oil the wheels of it, but private sector investment to really put in place the infrastructure. So we need to get better at identifying all of that and how we can lever in private finance in decarbonisation more generally, because we just are not going to be able to fund it all through the public purse. But in terms of the overall cost, I can come back to that. We'll explore that with climate colleagues.
That would be really useful. Thank you. And I'll kind of bundle up where I was going to go with that. Is so the Climate Ready Clyde report that I mentioned was produced largely by the university, but for the local authorities. Part of what they were trying to get at was their belief, which I would share, that they need more fiscal autonomy to deal with the consequences of this. Obviously, a lot of the damage to infrastructure that will be done by extreme weather is damage done to infrastructure that councils are responsible for. We've discussed council tax reform at length before, so I'm not going to get into that, but I would be interested in the Scottish Government's position in principle on the extent to which local authorities are able to raise their own revenue. So at the moment, council tax is what, 20%-ish of local authority budgets. Non-domestic rates, nominally a local tax, but in practice not. Councils have almost no discretion over it whatsoever. Does the Scottish Government think that the current balance is right, or would you like to see local authorities raising a far greater share of their budgets directly? So the norm across Europe would certainly be that municipalities raise a majority of their own budgets. Scotland is quite an outlier in that regard. Does the government have a direction of travel in the degree of fiscal autonomy that you would want councils to have? Should it be a majority of their budgets that they're raising for themselves?
So as a very high level, without getting into percentages, I am keen to empower local government to have more powers to raise more funds. Now, that obviously has to be done in a responsible way. They do have borrowing powers. They actually have more borrowing powers than the government has. But some are obviously more at the limit of those borrowing powers than others. So there is something, and we are exploring this in the space of outcomes-based funding. So the one that's most advanced is with Edinburgh around Granton for housing, but there's also a active travel decarbonisation element of that as well. There's opportunities to do more of that for individual local authorities. And then there's, I guess, a question about local government pension funds sitting at about 68 billion. Yeah. There is a question about the strategic use of that investment, which local government is keen to discuss as well. Now, housing has been raised as a kind of obvious one, but there could be opportunities for infrastructure, whether that's big kind of to mitigate against climate, but also some of the big decarbonisation, district heating. I think we need to explore whether there's more that can be done in that space. Now, clearly needs to be a return on investment, so it needs to be models that have a return.
Housing and energy being ideal for that because of a very stable return.
Are, I think, good examples. So I think there's more we can discuss in that space.
I would strongly support that, and if you could provide any further details to the committee about the work government's engaged with councils on pension funds being used for capital investment in particular, I think I would certainly find that beneficial. I imagine other members would as well.
On that. Yeah.
Just to say the Fiscal Commission did produce a report on the cost of climate mitigation and prevention in 2023, and if memory serves me right, it was 188 billion for Scotland alone across public and private sectors. So that's, good £35,000 a head. That's a lot of money, and I think it's almost we're almost blinded by the headlights for the sheer scale of it. I think it's probably why it's not been tackled as well as it should. And I should
we're trying to do that as a devolved nation.
Yeah, indeed, and they said that the UK couldn't meet its climate targets without Scotland because of the impact of peatland restoration, etc. But in terms of small business bonus scheme, I would say that the Federation of Small Businesses said that in 2008 that 1 in 6 other businesses were went bust without it at the time of the financial crisis. So certainly in times of crisis it may have a use. Let's move on. We'll have John to be followed by Craig.
Thanks very much, Convener. Now, public sector reform has been mentioned already, and I think the assumption of all of us is that that would lead to reduced money and reduced workforce, reduced costs. However, last week we had the Tertiary Education and Training Bill at stage 1, and it is moving things around, mainly from SDS into Scottish Funding Council, and the financial memorandum said it's going to cost 33 million. Now, last week it was encouraging we're down to 22, but it still seems quite a lot of money just to rearrange the furniture. And that is kind of going in the opposite direction of what we thought was going to happen, which was reduce the number of public bodies or reduce the number of workforce and so on. So I'm just wondering how these things tie together. Is that that bill a bit of an outlier, or is that a sign of things to come?
I'm not unsympathetic to the point you're making, Mr Mason. I think we need to, make sure that the reforms that we're bringing forward are consistent with the direction of travel. Now, clearly, there is a new minister in charge of that bill, and he'll want to have a look at the scope of it and the ambition of it, and so on and so forth. I've been thinking quite a lot about our approach to the 131 public bodies and public service reform, and I do think we need to avoid the trap of tinkering around the edges of this, and perhaps take a bit of a step back and ask ourselves, what does Scotland need in terms of our public body landscape? And I understand, some good things in that bill, not least around governance, that are really, really important. I can say very, very important. But we do need to have a think about, is it optimal to be kind of moving things around like that, or should we take a step back and ask ourselves, what do we need? Who needs to do what? What organisation is best to do what? So I am quite thoughtful about that, but it is a new minister who's getting his head around the bill, and obviously will have his own thoughts about the direction of travel. And we need to make sure that we have a good functioning delivery of apprenticeships, and we also need to ensure that the career service is in the right space. I want to avoid duplication, and if I look around the landscape, there's a lot of organisations that provide careers advice. So I just, and I'm not, this isn't, the bill is, there's a lot of important stuff in the bill, but I do think we do need to, and it's not even particular to the bill that I'm making these comments, it's more about, I think we need to take a step back and what do we need in that landscape? And I'm not convinced it's 131 public bodies that have emerged for a whole variety of reasons over the years, some in the government space, some not in the government space, but it does feel like a time just to take a step back and have a proper look at it.
Okay, well, that's helpful, and we'll look forward to what comes before. And I mean, as was said already, most of the committee was in Lithuania last week. But we did have a good debate on stage 1, and I think a number of us felt, and it was agreed, that the financial memorandum needs to be looked at more carefully, either by the Education Committee or by ourselves.
Well, I'll certainly take that away and speak to Ben McPherson about the financial memorandum.
Because it was good that the 33s come down to 22, but I think it was accepted by everybody, including Mr McPherson, that was not the final figure, and there's still some uncertainties.
Yeah.
And another interesting point that came out of that bill was that SDS, while Skills Development Scotland, while losing quite a lot of their work, or transferring it, I should say, to the Scottish Funding Council, will then be left a remaining organisation. and they are then planning to make some of their staff redundant. Now, and that's going to cost between £4 and £8 million. Now, that was a bit of a surprise. It wasn't in the financial memorandum, but it appeared in a letter subsequently. And it strikes me as slightly odd that an organisation transfers quite a lot of its staff doing a specific task, which is apprenticeship funding, and then is left with too many staff at the end. And that makes me think, I mean, it's not your specific issue, but I mean, it makes me think there's bits of the public sector that maybe have too many staff and savings could be made there, but there's other bits that don't. I mean, I don't even know if SDS counts as frontline or not frontline in your thinking or in Ivan McKee's thinking. But, you know, is it the case, are we looking at across-the-board savings, or would you feel, as I'm beginning to, that there are more savings to be made in some areas than others?
There's definitely more savings to be made in some areas than others.
That was a shorter answer to my question. Okay, thanks very much. Just to move on a few other points, there was a number of issues. The convener already asked you about the proceeds of crime. There's a number of other issues where the fiscal framework outturn and so on says that there's discussions ongoing or we're still looking at different things. I think one is the block grant adjustment for the aggregates tax. Is that progressing?
Yes, it is progressing, and I think I didn't get a chance to raise it with. Obviously, we've got a new CST, and I had some things that I absolutely had to raise in a very short introductory meeting. But I'm getting a list of things together to talk to him about in and around the FISC. And we will, I've just got the update here actually. So we have agreed with CST to apply a bespoke arrangement to set the baseline for the block grant adjustment for the aggregates tax. So we're going to use the outturn for the year of introduction of the tax, 26-27, and that will ensure compatibility between the Scottish aggregates tax and the UK aggregates levy and avoid distortions in year one revenues. So I hadn't realised that.
Okay, no,
so
that sounds
progress
good.
has been made even
well,
beyond
that's
what I had understood. So
that's great. Thanks very much. How about with bonds? Is that still being looked at and progressing?
Yeah, so we are progressing with bonds, and I obviously had given an update previously, but we're continuing with the due diligence process in line with what I set out at the 25-26 budget and in MTFS. We are, well, there's more work to do, particularly to establish specific structures for a successful first bond issuance and create the framework for future years. So I am hoping that to be able to say more on this later in the year, ahead of 26-27 budget, but things are progressing as we would have expected, and happy to key points to give the committee an update.
Okay, air departure tax?
So on ADP, Lucy, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, so we are actively working with the government on air departure tax. We've published a high-level principles for ADT, and that's going to help shape further policy development. And we've already recognised the role that air connectivity plays, and that ADT could and should make a contribution to reducing emissions from the aviation sector. We're going to be looking at the rates and bans, and including the rates on private jet flights, which I know is a particular area of interest and concern, and that will be looked at prior to any implementation of the tax. Until we have implementation, the UK-wide air passenger duty will continue to apply. So it's an ongoing area of work that my team is very closely and actively involved in.
Well, it's good it's progressing. Have we any kind of timescales for this at all?
Well, we are working, obviously, with the UK government to make sure that the issues that have been the reason for this taking a long time, you know, the Highlands and Islands connectivity, that we protect that and also have a system that complies with the UK government subsidy control regime. But discussions are progressing well. A time frame, we can try and we'll come back with what we think is realistic.
5 years, 10 years?
I'll come back to you on that. But I think discussions, I feel that probably in a better place now with the UK government.
Making progress.
Discussions at official level, and we found UK government officials to be extremely helpful.
Okay.
So
Well,
maybe a bit more helpful movement.
Positive as well. And the final one I was going to ask you about, I was a little bit surprised in the Fiscal Framework Outturn report that there's still a section about assignment of VAT. And
As well, we thought we'd kicked that into touch long ago.
well, that was exactly the convener takes the words out of my mouth, and I think you'd indicated before that it really wasn't going to happen. So I'm surprised it's still in here as a possibility.
So really, in practice, would be highly unlikely that we would move forward under the current arrangements. And I think I've said that before.
Yes.
I mean, I'll have a look at the wording, but just for avoidance of doubt, it is not our intention, nor that of the UK government, to move forward because of the inability to resolve the risks. But if the wording doesn't properly reflect that, then we'll have a look at that.
Well, I mean, to quote one bit, it says the Scottish Government remains committed to fulfilling the Smith recommendations, which does include that, but must also protect the Scottish budget from unnecessary levels of risk. So that's fine. But
yeah.
I just thought you might have been saying we're forgetting VAT. We've agreed with the UK government it's not happening.
So you know, I guess it's just drawing the distinction between saying that we would like to have VAT along with all the other revenue-raising powers,
sure,
but it cannot be through a system of assigned revenue. So it's distinguishing between the principle and what was being suggested in terms of assigned revenues, because that's where the risk involves. If the UK government was to turn around tomorrow and say, well, just give you responsibility over VAT full stop, that's a very different matter.
Sure.
And it's probably just trying to make that distinction.
Okay, well, that's helpful to get that clarification. Thanks, Convener.
No, exactly. And while you're at it, we'd like the devolution of fags, bevy and fuel. That'll bring a few bob into the Scottish Government's coffers. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
In response to Mr Greer, you talked about how you would like to make sure that local government is empowered, but obviously I don't see this very often. I have full sympathy with you in respect to the timing of the UK budget and the knock-on effect that's going to have in terms of the Scottish budget. That is obviously going to have a knock-on effect for Scottish councils, who I think at this point in time are very concerned that they are effectively the last link in the chain and that it could cause them real issues. There are certain things you could do now to make their job easier. So in respect of your remarks in relation to Mr Greer, would you now rule out a council tax freeze next year in order to allow them to start their modelling earlier?
Well, I'm not going to start ruling things in or out at this committee session, but I think we've been pretty clear that, you know, we want to work with local government. The framework that I described earlier on was about full kind of transparency, open book, no surprises, all of that. I think, though, your first point about timing, I would want to assure local government that we do very much have their budget setting deadlines in mind around how do we give enough certainty to local government. Now, some of that could be around what level of agreement we can reach when with opposition parties around the budget. I want to be able to give local government enough certainty about their envelopes to be able to not interrupt their budget setting cycles, which run through late February into early March. So just to assure you, it is very much up in my kind of thinking that is a priority, that we need to make sure that they are able to to set their budgets.
Just to kind of reverse back a little bit in terms of the kind of politician's answer, would you anticipate, therefore, that councils will be able to set their council tax rates next year? Because that will be effectively one of the levers that they have at their disposal. If they're doing pre-planning, it would be to anticipate what their multi-year increases will be.
We'll set out the position on that at the budget, but as I've pointed to the framework and the principles around that.
Okay, so looking forward, obviously that's the purpose of this session. How concerned are you on a kind of scale of 1 to 10 at the underlying issues that we now face the budget, both in terms of your projected spend and the projected revenues that you've got coming in?
Okay, so obviously I set out at the MTFS and the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan the measures that we were going to have to take to ensure that we could continue to provide the services that we want to provide and meet the key priorities that we've set out. And the reductions that are set out mainly through workforce reduction and reform, shared services, doing things differently, efficiencies, better value for money, are all facing in that direction to ensure that we can, as we're required to do, balance our budget every year, but also that we can afford the important interventions that we've set out, so things like the Scottish Child Payment, real terms increases in health funding. That does require us to do all of those things. We're not the only ones doing it. UK Government are doing it as well as the Welsh Government, because although funding is increasing, the pressures, demographic changes and all of that is outstripping that funding, and that is, unless something changes, is going to remain to be the case. So, in short, yeah, that is what we have to do, and that's what we've set out. The spending review will show the envelopes going forward, and it's obviously up to opposition parties if they want to change those envelopes as per the SFC's challenge, I think.
But you can see, as the SFC does, that the gaps between the Scottish Government spending projections and the available funding are significant. You would accept that at this point in time?
Well, that's why we took the action in June to set out where we would close the gap. Now, clearly a lot of, there are some moving parts around the spending review. So, for example, on social security spend, the updated forecasts in the autumn are going to show the movement in terms of the block grant adjustment of the U-turn on welfare policy, which is probably going to adjust the projection by about 440 million by, I think, 29-30, wasn't it? Yeah. And then, there are other unknowns. So if there is an announcement on two-child cap, for example, that we have factored in about 150 million to start with, but that grows as the projection goes towards 29-30. So some of these, there are some unknowns at the moment which will impact on that gap, in addition to the steps that we've already set out that we'll take. And we'll make sure the committee's updated as we get confirmation of those forecasts.
So the SFC's projection of a £4.7 billion gap identifies that it's £2.6 billion in resource spending and £2.1 billion in capital spending. How concerned should we be that the capital spend gap is proportionately more, given that capital expenditure is, in one sense, the funding the engines of growth, physical infrastructure? Yeah. Is that a long-term concern? So
I touched on this earlier on, and the problem is the spending review has not been good for us in resource or indeed capital. So if you look at the capital projection, it is actually on a declining trajectory at a time where, you're right, we want to be investing and we have ambitions. You're right, the link from infrastructure investment and growing the economy. We have set out some ambitious targets in terms of the spend on housing, for example, 4.9 billion, and that's a mixture of public but also private investment. So levering in investment in mid-market rent, for example, by the private sector is very, very important, and that will be a big contributor to affordable housing. We are also looking at how do we expand that envelope beyond CDEL. Now, that means we're looking at things like revenue finance, we're looking at things like outcomes-based borrowing, local government, and other ways of expanding that capital envelope. Because if we were only to stick to CDEL, then, as you've pointed out, it's declining and there is a gap there. So we are looking at ways of expanding that envelope, and I'll set that out in the infrastructure investment plan and pipeline.
Okay, good. We'll come to some of the detailed issues in a moment, but giving evidence to us recently, Andy Whitty from College of Scotland said, in respect to the tax base, that you grow the tax base by having more people working and getting them to a working position quicker. What is the Scottish Government's strategy to increase the tax base in Scotland?
Well, our economic plans through NSET are very explicit about growing the economy, playing to our strengths. We have a lot of economic strengths in key sectors. The specific support that we have routed through, for example, the expansion of offshore wind, the support for tech scalar innovation, the support for food and drink, making sure that we're investing in areas of the economy that are areas that are areas of growth. And of course, we have a lot of success in terms of attracting inward investment to Scotland through SDI and others. So we are very focused on that. We also need to reduce economic inactivity. Not easy to do, but a lot of our programmes through employability are focused on reducing economic inactivity and also increasing the value of work and the hours worked. So we kind of touched on some of that earlier on around the childcare offer and supporting women in particular to increase the value of the work that they're doing, because that obviously helps in terms of the tax contribution.
So would you accept in relation to the interplay between UK benefits and Scottish-specific benefits, so for example having the Scottish Child Payment dependent upon universal credit? You and I have talked in the past about you don't like to put cliff edges in, but would you accept that the interplay between those benefit systems is actually putting in place a barrier to work, because people will lose one benefit if they do more hours and therefore they have greater earned income? So the structure of the benefit system in Scotland, some of that devolved, may actually be now working against getting people into employment.
So it was important when the Scottish Child Payment was introduced that we were able to get an agreement with the UK Government and the DWP that there would be no erosion of the support that they were receiving elsewhere, because that it had to be an additionality. And it is, by absolutely all the evidence points to it being the single most important intervention in ensuring that Scotland has falling rates of child poverty compared to anywhere else in the UK. So as an intervention, I think it has, cross-party support in understanding that. It is important that there's no cliff edges. So, for example, I'm quite thoughtful about calls to increase Scottish Child Payment. I think there's a balance to be struck there. I think as long as it continues to increase with inflation, I think it's at about the right level, because it's one of the pillars, but getting people into to work is clearly the best route out of poverty. So we need to make sure that the Scottish Child Payment continues to lift children out of poverty. And I think it's at about the right level to do that. If it was much higher than that, I think there would be a question about whether it becomes then a barrier to work. But I don't think it is. I don't believe it is, or there's evidence to suggest that it is presently.
Okay. The other area we've discussed in the past is the issue of adult disability payment and the difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Giving evidence to us recently, Professor Breeden from the Scottish Fiscal Commission said that in Scotland the idea that the reviews are largely but not entirely self-certified, whereas in the UK system that is less the case. He went on to say that we can reasonably expect that if people are self-certifying, they are less likely to sign themselves off a benefit than they would if they were reviewed elsewhere. Are you concerned that as the percentage of the budget in Scotland is taken, a greater percentage is taken up by social security, and that ADP payment is rising significantly as well, that you're going to have to address the criteria in the assessment process, unless otherwise it could just simply run out of control?
So let me say a few things. We have explored this at length, and I know Shirley-Anne Somerville was here as well and explored some of these issues at length. I think it's just worth us all bearing in mind that the system that has been set up here in Scotland was one that was made on the basis of cross-party support for the secondary legislation which set out the eligibility methods for social security. So, you know, those principles of fairness, dignity, respect were all, all parties in Parliament wanted that to be the case. It was cross-party consensus on the criteria, on assessment, and so on and so forth. So this didn't just emerge kind of out of nowhere, because people quite rightly wanted it to look and feel different from the system south of the border. Now, that though, you know, having said all of that, it is important that that we have a system that works and works for those receiving, but also works for the taxpayer as well. So, for example, the difference, and we again explored this at length, the difference on reviews and assessments with the DWP and Social Security Scotland is not as black and white as the figures would suggest, because, and again this point was made by Shirley-Anne Somerville, getting it right first time means that you're less likely to then have appeals that are successful. If you look at the number of people on appeals that win their appeal under the DWP system, that then reduces, I think, the figure to about 9%, if I'm remembering correctly. So the difference, there is still a difference, but the difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK is markedly narrower because of the number of cases won on appeal. The issue about reviews, and I think you probably heard from Shirley-Anne Somerville that they are looking at the reviews. And I think, to be fair to Social Security Scotland, the focus has been on safe and secure transfer of existing cases. And given the number of cases, it's about 350,000, it was important to make sure that that was done properly. They're now looking at, well, how do you make sure that the review system ensures that people are receiving the money that they should receive, and their needs are as their needs were previously, because some people's needs do change. I think Shirley-Anne Somerville also put on record, though, an important point, that the proportion of the resource budget which the Scottish Government has chosen to invest in enhancing social security in Scotland compared to England and Wales is projected to increase by less than 1% by 2029-30 compared to the current financial year. Now, given what I said earlier about there are some moving parts here around welfare reform, U-turns and two-child cap, that figure may reduce even further, because those are the forecasts haven't been adjusted.
Obviously, enhancing the benefit system is one thing, but actually having more people on an equivalent benefit is a much deeper problem. And I think both Professor Ove and Professor Breeden, when they were in front of us, accepted that there's an issue around transfers, but they did say that they had relative confidence that there is an underlying trend in the Scottish system which is of concern. And that is going to emerge quite clearly between now and the end of the decade.
So the point, I'd go back to 2 points. One is getting it right first time is important, but also Social Security Scotland have said in terms of the review processes, that's the next phase of making sure that what people are getting is what they're entitled to.
And in respect to the £36 million that it was said it would be inhumane to draw back off people that have been misclaimed or through fraud, moving forward, are you going to get tough on those who either misclaim benefits, or where there is an overpayment? Are you going to be robust enough to go and actually reclaim that
So
money?
let me deal with the 36 million. So that relates to the total sum of historic devolved debts that either transferred to the Scottish Government under devolution or were accrued under the lifetime of the agency agreement, so when the DWP was still administering. So this is historic debt, not somehow something created.
I'm just wondering, but what message does it send out if the Scottish Government says there's £36 million of taxpayers' money and we're effectively just going to let it go?
Well, we're not, though. We're not going to. They're not going to let it go. And we're looking at. Social Security Scotland is going to and will continue to take a zero tolerance approach to fraud, and there will be any decision to write off any debts would be only on an exceptional basis and after full assessment is taken. I can take you through a lot of the detail of what they are doing. So they are using intelligence gathering and working with partners to identify and respond to fraud quickly and effectively. Suspected fraud is actively being referred to the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service. There are a number of cases already with the Crown Office, and they are making sure that they're recovering overpayments, and they have recovered some significant amounts of money recovered in the last 2 years. So, yeah, is there more to be done? Yeah, there's more to be done, but I wouldn't want anybody to have anything other than an impression that Social Security Scotland take a zero tolerance approach to overpayment or fraud. And
maybe the media coverage did speak to another narrative there.
Well, but that doesn't mean it's correct.
No,
though.
but I suppose the words were put out in the public domain. But just to briefly move on to two final potential risks. One is public sector pay. Obviously, you set a 9% policy. In respect of all of the public sector pay agreements so far, they are ahead of that on a projected basis. So are you now in the territory where you're potentially saying to public sector workers that they should be anticipating, those who've had pay deals already, that they should be looking at nominal pay settlements in the third year of around about 1%, because that is effectively where they're going to end up unless you're willing to bust your own pay policy?
Well, look, let me say again about pay. When you're setting pay policy, you have to draw on a range of judgments of what you have in front of you at the time. And it was based on inflation forecasts over the 3-year period and a desire to get some long-term certainty on pay for public sector workers. So that's why we tied in anything going beyond 3% for year one. Had to be a multi-year deal. So we had to get into, I guess, buying some peace in the industrial landscape through multi-year deals, and we've actually been quite successful.
Maybe, Minister, you buy it too generously.
Say again?
Maybe you buy peace too generously.
Well, I think the cost of industrial action, you can't underestimate that. I mean, imagine how many appointments would be cancelled in the NHS if you had widespread industrial action in the NHS. It would well outstrip the pay deals. I think the other thing to bear in mind, which we do not have control of, is when UK public sector pay bodies give their verdict. It is very difficult then to walk away from that. So the UK government set a 2.8% pay policy, and of course pay review bodies come out and they were way beyond that. And now they took into account a more up-to-date inflation figure because they had that at hand. But to be fair to the UK government, they were left in the same position we are, that if you don't, what's the point in having an independent pay review body if you ignore the findings? Okay. So they didn't ignore the findings. It would have been very difficult for us to ignore them either. I think where we've got to, though, is by getting mainly 2-year deals, we're able now to focus all of that effort on reform and efficiency and doing things differently rather than the annual round of pay negotiations. And that's got a big value to it, and that's what me and my colleagues are focused on doing. So I think we've been pragmatic. We've tried to land in a space that is reasonable gives some certainty, buys us some peace and gets us moving into reform territory.
Fine, just one very final short question. You spoke earlier about reducing the overall size of the Scottish Government and also the Invest to Save, just two questions, sorry, the Invest to Save scheme, both as being fundamentally important to this. Can you confirm to the committee how many applications were made to the Invest to Save scheme?
I check if I've got... Well, I think we'll probably. I'll come back. There is a figure. I just can't remember what it was, but there was a lot of interest.
Yeah, well, I think on the 7th of August there was a Freedom of Information request that said 24 bodies submitted applications, and there were in total 40 applications. And amongst the 24 bodies were different Scottish Government directorates. What is that? And also included health boards and local authorities. What does it say about the appetite for public sector reform that 24 of 140 to 200 bodies actually had a plan or a submission that they wanted to make to this ambitious and bold and wide-ranging scheme?
Well, so two things about that. One is they may have been further advanced in their thinking to be able to put in the proposition, because the proposition had to be quite detailed and robust. But look, the second point is no part of the public sector is going to be able to stand back and say this is not for me.
Clearly some of them are presently. They just think we'll sit this one out.
They're not, because whether or not they're putting in an Invest to Save proposition doesn't mean that they're not getting on with work in their own area in terms of reform. They're going to have to meet the efficiency targets. They're going to have to meet the workforce reduction targets, whether or not they put in a bid to Invest to Save. So the two things are not, it's not you only have to do it if you put in an Invest to Save bid. Some of those will be a bit more ambitious, so they need some money to oil the wheels of change. But not every change would need some of that money to invest to make it happen. So it's not the only story in town. It's an important one, but there's a lot of other work going on in the background.
Fine, and this is the very final question. The 0.5% reduction.
Questions you think they have?
Well, it was a two-part question, the second part coming. Just in relation to the 0.5% workforce reduction target, Professor Graham Roy said to us that he was concerned that if you rely too much on natural attrition, you will end up not having the right people in the right place. How do you avoid that becoming an issue? So
that could be an issue, and we need to avoid that, because I think the convener made a point about the skills and experience. So that needs to be managed, and partly it will be natural attrition, voluntary severance, but I think organisations need to be very mindful of that in terms of who is leaving the organisation, because there will need to be good quality leadership retained within every organisation, and that's something we would expect organisations to have very much at the front of their mind.
Thank you. Thank you for bearing us.
Hi.
Morning.
I'll try not to ask too many questions. I know it's been a long session for you. First of all, I just wanted to check what your approach is to the forthcoming budget in terms of involvement of other political parties, and what approaches you'd had thus far, if any, to try and influence your thinking.
We have. I think we're trying to build on the progress we've made before, where we will be very keen to hear ideas and to have discussions around where there might be landing space for support for the budget. So clearly there is what relationships to build on in terms of last year's budget, where we secured the support of the Liberal Democrats and Green colleagues. But we will continue to have discussions with others. I'm very mindful that Mr Hoy's colleague Liz Smith will be very keen to see support for her outdoor education bill, for example. So it may bring a different approach to the budget.
2021.
Well, but you can't will the means. I just say that I hope there is genuinely a constructive discussion, whether it's about Liz Smith's bill or other issues, and we're approaching it in that vein. And just one final point, the point that Craig Hoy came to earlier on, which is an important one about local government budgets. I would like us to just have a think about, given we are, through no fault of our own, late because of the UK budget at the end of November, and we have the backstop of dissolution of Parliament, whether we're able to take a more pragmatic, consensual approach to agreeing, that we don't want to draw out the drama through the various stages of the budget, because local government, apart from anything else, needs to know its envelopes. And I think, we are keen to see whether there is space to build on that.
Yeah, and actually you led me on to my next comment, which was about local government. I mean, you mentioned it a couple of times earlier, but I note from your last appearance here, you noted that the Scottish Government is keen to codify the local government fiscal framework. And you mentioned some of the considerations, transparency and so on.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to check where you are in terms of the codification.
Yeah, so a lot of work has been done to try and kind of put a kind of ring around the things that can be agreed upon. So I'm trying to work with local government to say, well, if we can codify these elements about how we do business in relation to budgets, that becomes the framework. So the point about no surprises, early engagement, open book, all of that. So we have made good progress, and actually, there's just a little bit of frustration that it's, that there's just one or two things that have avoided us just agreeing the framework and publishing it. So. I'm optimistic we can get there, because it's 95% plus of the stuff that they themselves say were made a huge difference to the budget setting for 25-26.
Okay, thank you. Next wee point was that, I mean, you'll know last year's sort of budget, I was quite critical about any plans to spend ScotWind to fund, in effect, other types of spend. I know you can't give spoiler alerts about the budget, but I suppose I'm seeking for some reassurance that ScotWind funding can continue to be used for the purpose for which it was originally set out, i.e. to support growth in a very important sector. Can you give us a steer at all on that?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to that point, and I think there were some good examples in the 25-26 budget that pointed to that, whether it's the support to Shetland and Orkney for their infrastructure and investment in their connectivity space. So, I'm very sympathetic.
Okay, thank you. And another sort of question was around trading standards. This is related to public administration. I mean, we've talked a lot about, we've ended up getting quite embroiled in public sector headcount and accountability and so on. But part of the benefit stems from my early commentary. I used to talk about shared services, and we know that trading standards in Scotland now is quite a kind of critical juncture. It's administered through all the 32 different local accountants authorities, and that's led to a very fragmented service. It's a sort of example that if another model was created, it might be more efficient and more effective from a kind of provisioning of service. And I'm just wondering, in terms of once we get past this kind of, public sector focus on the civil service, might that be the sort of thing that would be looked at with sympathy? I think the intentions of putting it down to local authorities were probably good, but it's no longer functioning as it should because it's so disparate and fragmented.
I think it's an honest conversation we'll have to have with local government. I'm very conscious of the conversation we've just had about the framework and no surprises. But the shared service space for local government is a massive opportunity. So there is a discussion to what lies best where. So some of that might be on a regional basis, some of it might be on a Once for Scotland. The same issues apply to planning. Now, that's a little bit more complex because of kind of planning authority rules, but we have developed the National Hub to try and supplement the role of local government planning decisions, because they're all battling for the same people and sort of fishing in the same pond of a small number of individuals, and you see people kind of moving between authorities. I think the difficulty I would have, to be really honest, is I cannot, and it would get me into some difficulty in Verity House space of saying to local government, you've got to share services here, but they really do need to begin to think about shared services. Some good examples where some waste management services are provided by one authority to others. It saved a lot of money, but it needs to happen as a kind of default that local authorities need to be looking at. Can we provide this on a regional basis? Because just the fiscal position requires them to look at that. So we'll continue to have those discussions. I think trading standards is a good example of where it's becoming to a point where there might be no choice, but we need to do it on a planned basis rather than just on a kind of service failure. So I'm very keen to continue to have those discussions and look at ways of encouraging and incentivising and thinking down that road.
And Teeny, last question. I had quite an interesting exchange last week in the Chamber with Angus Robertson, the Culture Secretary. I was asking a question about how the kind of assessment of the fiscal sustainability of our performing arts companies, and we had a good discussion about how important they are and what value they add and so on. It does appear that there's some differentiation between the performing art companies in terms of how focused they are on their fiscal sustainability and understanding the GVA they bring into the wider community. And it did make me think, and it's too late for this budget cycle, obviously, but how conscious we look at those organisations from a fiscal and financial perspective, rather than just saying nice things about them because they do nice things for our community. And I think the Culture Secretary was very open to that. But I just wondered how consciously you yourself, because it tends to be, it's this whole silo thing that they go through culture and nobody actually looks at them because they fundamentally have to be sustainable. Yeah. And they're very grateful for the support they get from government, but just wondered any reflections on that, how actively that scrutiny goes on in the Scottish Government.
So we've had deep dives with each of the portfolios, getting into line-by-line spending decisions, including in the culture space, and these discussions are very active about even though they're getting an increasing profile of investment into culture, they absolutely need to ensure that they are delivering fiscal sustainability, but also value for money. And again, is there stuff in the shared service space that whether it's the national performance companies, can they maybe share personnel and so on and so forth. So they absolutely need to be looking at all of that in the same way as any others. Creative Scotland, obviously going through its review, and it needs to be active in the space as well of fiscal sustainability. And I think a lot of organisations could be more effective at attracting private sector funding, for example, maybe in helping them to support them to have the means of how do they go about that. Some are very effective, some others not. So sharing some of that best practice of how do you go about making sure that you are attracting investment from elsewhere as well as the core funding that you receive. So the short answer is yes, they should absolutely be looking at all of that.
Yeah, and that's what I've seen, the RSNO in particular has been very successful with it. It's kind of music for films and so on, and they've really quite started to differentiate themselves. But anyway, okay, thank you.
Definitely.
Thanks very much. I mean, interestingly, in the 11 to 16 Finance Committee did take evidence from organisations like Equity, the BBC, Channel 4, Creative Scotland, Scottish Screen, but they don't really respond to calls for evidence from us because I think they just go through the Culture Committee, who then make recommendations through their own report. But there's no reason why they can't. We can't speak to them. We're not all Philistines. And incidentally, in Lithuania, they built an opera house, a concert hall, and they're building a third one in Vilnius, all within a few hundred yards of each other as we speak. So they clearly see that the arts are an opportunity to boost revenue. In terms of sharing services, I mean, you know, a lot of councils already share payroll and you know, council tax collection, and even share roads, you know, the management of roads across local authority. But trading standards is an issue. There's 250 less than there were 5 years ago. Yeah. And I think one of the issues that local government will continually raise with you is the issue that non-statutory services are being really kind of really been hit hard in recent years, and the room to manoeuvre is limited. But I just want to ask one question really to finish off, and that's on an issue we've not really touched on, and it's just about taxation. Now, Professor David Heald, who's given evidence to this committee often in the past, although not recently, has always railed against the chronic state of the UK tax system, which is anything but progressive. If you look at he's often showed us a graph in which you see income. One thinks of income, you know, and taxation going like that. In actual fact, it's a bit like, you know, the skyline in New York, frankly, when you look at it. And obviously we have to work within that framework. But saying that, we still have anomalies in Scotland whereby, and I've mentioned this in previous years, you know, the marginal rate of taxation for someone earning £44,000 a year is higher than for £51,000 because of the interplay between income tax, national insurance, etc. So in terms of the medium-term financial strategy, it mentions, and I quote, 2 key measures to ensure a strategic approach to tax. These are 1, the improvement of the operation and performance of the existing tax system, and 2, future tax reform to deliver sustainable and growing tax revenue. So I'm just wondering if you can touch on what improvements of the operation and performance of the existing tax system you have in mind, and secondly, what future tax reform will deliver those sustainable and growing tax revenues.
So, firstly, let me say I do recognise the issue about the marginal rate. It's just a very, very difficult thing to do anything about, given the cost in the current climate. But it is not something I dismiss. So I think the first thing about a tax system is the more people understand it, the higher the compliance rates. So there is something about, because we have some complexity and people don't always understand the differences that we have a Scottish tax system and and what that tax system is. So part of the work that we've been doing is to raise awareness of what the tax system is and what people's obligations are, and that that we want to drive high levels of compliance with that system. In terms of the growing, and also, sorry, I should say, a link to that is stability. So we've obviously given the stability on income tax for the remainder of this Parliament. I think that helps people then know how to, it helps them to manage their finances and for businesses to plan and make investment decisions with confidence, knowing what the future holds. And that is why we made that decision. I should say, just in terms of a little bit more detail, the strategy publishes for the first time some areas of research interest on tax to support evidence and evaluation of tax policy, because we want to ensure that whether it's on enhanced compliance, taxpayer communications, tax legislation, that we have the best available evidence to us for future decisions. And we are looking, as you know, at future reforms, particularly in the work we've asked the Scottish Land Commission to look at around land values going forward. But these are for the future rather than in the immediate term. Touched earlier on around how to generate additional tax revenues. Partly that is to make sure our economy is growing, and we have some some good indicators about the Scottish economy, even though times are tough, and we have policies from the UK government which have definitely had a dampener effect on recruitment, for example, and growth of companies because of ENICs, and that has definitely had an impact on vacancy rates. But on the counter to that is that we have some sectors in Scotland that are doing very, very well indeed. And we want to make sure that through our policies, our support through our agencies and NSET, that they are facing in the same direction to help those sectors to continue to grow and to do well. And many of them do very well on the global stage, not just in terms of the UK. So I think it's a long-winded answer to say that we are sort of certainty, compliance, but also that growth of the economy. Final point would be one of the levers that we don't have, which is so critical to many of our sectors, is over skills and migration. So many of the sectors tell us all the time that they cannot get people that they need, and it is more difficult for them to recruit from elsewhere, and that is a major impediment. We still have, on the positive side, net in migration to Scotland from elsewhere, from the rest of the UK, I should say, across all tax bands, and that is a good thing. But we would like to do more in that space, because there are sectors that are wanting to recruit.
Yeah. There are 55 million people south of the border, of course, and there has been a net influx, and I think it's important that they are of working age, which I think is really important. But some areas, such as aerospace, say that the highest rate of tax in Scotland is a deterrent in terms of attracting the kind of engineers that they would like. Incidentally, although it's 48% in Scotland, when we were in Lithuania last week, their top rate is 32%. So not everyone in Europe has got very high rates of personal taxation. I think we've given that a really good go this morning. I think your responses have been very helpful to the committee, and I'd like to thank you and your officials for coming along this morning. Is there any final points you want to make to the committee just before
Just
we
that
wind
I'll come
up?
back on some of the areas. We've taken a note of the areas that said we'll come back with more information, and we'll do that as quickly as we can. And we'll keep in contact about the date. I'll reflect very much on what's been said about the budget date.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks very much. And we'll just call a 5-minute break to allow our witnesses and indeed broadcasting and official report to leave, and we'll move into private session.
Thank you.